So it's a pleasure to be here. It's a pleasure also to be losing my AV connection as soon as I start talking. I've shortened the title of my talk because I'm learning the difference between a title and an abstract, and titles are supposed to be shorter. I'll begin by selling you on something that you're already convinced about, which is the value of phenomenology, but I'll just, my personal sense of why it's valuable, and I'll just skip to this second bullet point, ontology as phenomenology. For ethnographers, what's useful about it as a perspective, I think, is that we get to know what certain types of social abstractions, cultural abstractions are, and not what they are in some sort of abstract or schematic sense, but what they are as experiences. So I'll skip to this last point. Sarah Willen's work, if you are all not familiar with it, is an ethnography of migrant illegality in Israel, basically what it's like to be a non-white illegal immigrant in Israel. And so the point is that it's not useful to understand it necessarily, it is still useful to understand it as a political or legal concept, but really what illegality is a way of being in the world, a constant fear of deportation, a fear of even talking to the police about a domestic violence issue. But the paradox of phenomenology is that we are interested in what other people experience, how they might experience illegality, how they might experience homelessness, and yet it is fundamentally unknowable what other people are thinking. For example, I don't know what you all are thinking right now. Maybe I will know later. Sorry? Huh? Try! And so the point of this, as you pointed out, is that I am a sociopath, unable to figure out. But anyway, so Robert Desjardins, in his sensory biographies, an ethnography in Nepal, he wrote about in 2003, writes that, and this is my emphasis, you cannot readily tap into the lived experience of cultural subjects, be they in Boston or Calcutta. You can only talk with and live with among them. So words really are the stuff of meaning and evidence here, along with other manifest actions, a look here, a gesture there. And so the question for this talk is very, very simple, which is, must it be so? Are words, talk, gaze, gesture really the only ways that we can surmise that people are experiencing, or are there other ways that we can approach this ethnographically? So in terms of field methods, this is really what the concern of this talk is, that phenomenological ethnography needs some sort of methodological innovation, and here I'm thinking not of phenomenology as a methodology, as it's often considered, but rather as an analytical framework or analytical theory. And so what kinds of field methodologies allow us to better know the other's experience other than a moral education of Ritwik, which is what Deborah Kapjan has proposed. So the proposal is to stage, which is preposterous, of course, and I will get to why this is preposterous at the end of the talk, is to stage encounters with virtual performers, ask the performers to play with the system, and compare them to a human performer, and use this as a way of eliciting commentary about their experience of collaborative playing. Coming more specifically to the context that I'm going to be talking about ethnographically, the question that has oriented a lot of my work is, what do performers of free improvisation actually experience when they play with other musicians, and then more specifically, how, if at all, do they critically evaluate such experiences? The motivation for this question is that there is this long-standing utopian discourse about free improvisation, that it is a non-idiomatic transcendence of all kinds of genres and creative constraints, that one is at liberty to do as they wish, free of a leader, hierarchy in the ensemble, a composition or a composer that structures this. And so what we also have along the way is an ethnophenomenology, that is, a theory of phenomenology that is concomitant with free improvisation, that by playing in this practice one experiences a type of freedom, a type of equal partnership. So that this is not lost, I have also spent time doing things without machines in my fieldwork. This fieldwork is also based on many years as a saxophonist and concert goer involved in these various scenes in Berlin, Chicago, and San Francisco. This participant observation, this is the issue. It largely confirms this utopian discourse. So for example, when I was first interested in free improvisation, I asked an older improviser is there a such thing as a good player? What makes a good improviser, etc.? And very, thankfully, he disabused me of my ignorance and my expectation of some sort of normative framework for this practice. And he said that there's no such thing as a good improviser. In the years since then, I've played hundreds of sessions with people where all anyone has to say at the end of it is, "That was great, let's do it again," even though this may not really be what they meant at all. And so in the end of the day, what I've observed rather systematically is that if players do not like the way another player plays, they simply disengage, they just don't call them back. And so this, over time you can see that there are some preferences that develop. You see that certain performers are favored either by an audience or by other performers. So it is suggestive of some sort of positive or negative evaluation, positive or negative experience, either as an audience member or as a fellow performer. But I would like to know more about what that experience is, other than just thumbs up or thumbs down. Thank you. It might also seem that these preferences are expressed in the moment by how performers play. That they play loudly, that they play quietly, that they do various sorts of gestures in order to enact their disgust or pleasure in the situation. If at all possible, please watch the cellist's face. So what we see in this clip is that the cellist drops out for a good long while this sound mass builds for some time, and then essentially waits his turn, or whatever type of interpretation you want to have of this behavior. So the question becomes, what does this silence mean? Does it mean that he was loving what was going on, or that he was thoroughly disgusted by it? Because it's so dark, we don't really know. But what has been recently established in more empirical psychological studies of music, which is that these silences have any and all meanings. They could mean that someone is loving what's going on, that they're bored, that they are disgusted, and that at the end of the day, still we're stuck with the situation of not knowing really what the performer actually experienced, because they will cover it with this pleasantry, "That was great, let's do it again." And so, again, we're coming to this question. We have these gestures that we observe, silence, gaze, all kinds of things that performers do, but in the end of the day, we really don't know exactly what they mean, and so must we simply surmise what they mean, or are there other methodologies? And as I admit in the paper, I have backed into this the methodology that I'm proposing in this case, which is alongside my engagement in free improvisation, I also started developing various virtual performers of free improvisation. So the one I'll focus on today is called Maxine. So the concept is basically that you play with it just as you would play with another free improviser. So the improvisers that I've worked with do not need to know anything about how to program or anything like that. They just come and have a session with me. They play their instrument with the system just as they would with another player. So here is a short clip of what Maxine sounds like. so on and so on and so on the piece goes. So just a quick note about what Maxine is. On a technical level, Maxine is a system. It is a software system that I designed. Like many Indian people design other software systems, I have designed my own. And it plays a type of music that I've been passionate about and ambivalent about over several years. But for a social scientific or cultural studies perspective, what Maxine is an ethnographic performance. So in performance studies, there's a long tradition of people performing their ethnographies. So this is how I'm thinking of Maxine, in the sense that one performs various words, scenes that they've encountered in their fieldwork. Maxine is sort of an ethnographic version, an algorithmic version of that. It's the experience of playing with another musician, all of the joys, frustrations that come along with it, except one is free of the judgments that come along with it, because Maxine obviously has no opinions of her or itself. Just to clarify, Maxine is not my proposal about how improvisers actually think. How improvisers actually think is not something I think we can really know from this, and I don't think Maxine is algorithmically some sort of representation of what they experience. That is something we have to figure out some other way. Over several years, I've spent a lot of time testing Maxine with lots of different improvisers. So as I said, I invite them to my studio to play with Maxine, sometimes after several email exchanges because of their natural skepticism of the idea. And so the technical purpose of this initially was just to identify flaws in the system and collect expert feedback in order to improve Maxine, make Maxine play like a great human improviser. And so this is what I say in the paper that I accidentally discovered. This is what is the accidental utility that I discovered in this, is that it really shatters this egalitarian veneer that improvisers have of wanting to never really disclose the fact that they're pissed off about how other players play. And so it allows players to feel free to talk about what they experience, how they want other players to listen, how they want other players to react to them. And so, as one player put it to me, he was in the middle of a long list of his complaints about how Maxine was confusing him, how Maxine was always playing him into the silence, doing this, that, and the other. And he said, I wish I could tell other people things like this, as sort of a sign of his frustration with the fact that he can't tell musicians that he's worked with over many years, or musicians that he might have met tonight, about what he thinks about how they're playing because of this palpable culture of egalitarianism around free improvisation. And so what this shows us is that some phenomenologies, the problem in studying certain phenomenologies ethnographically is that there may be a prohibition, what I'm calling a prohibition on metaphenomenological discourse. That is, there are experiences that people don't want to talk about because there's some cultural norm that prevents them from doing that, and therefore it becomes a little bit more difficult to really know what the cultural phenomenology of a particular sphere might be. And so in this case, they don't want to admit necessarily that they're pissed off about or frustrated with other improvisers in the same way that in a liberal sphere, one doesn't want to admit to various other types of illiberal intolerances. And so the flip side of this is that there are certain types of phenomenologies or phenomena or phenomenal experiences that carry a certain sense of prestige. So one example would be a connection with the divine. To report a connection with the divine might carry some sort of social prestige. The same might go for the experience of the sublime, of freedom, of a feeling of true tolerance of any type of playing behavior. And so what I say is painful is that it is painful to say this, but it might be useful for us to consider that the utility of being skeptical of these types of experiences as reported baldly by our informants or interlocutors or whatever term we're using these days. So, coming to the actual examples, this is a situation with Marcus and Maxine. So Marcus is a 40-year-old trombonist from northern Germany. He's been in Berlin since the early 2000s. He's active in free improvisation, jazz, and Afrobeat. We met on an Afrobeat gig, actually. That was how I developed the contact with him. And so with Maxine, there's a situation where, so Maxine is playing synthesizer. She's simulating what a synthesizer improviser would do. And there's a long period where Maxine is in this, or gets sort of stuck on this undulating feedback pattern, interspersed with little blasts of synthesizer. So in that, that's just a short snippet of this 3-minute passage. Marcus scowls at the amplifier, but since improvisers are always scowling at everything that they could possibly scowl at, it was difficult for me to tell whether this scowl was a scowl, or this scowl was a scowl. So at the end of the piece, he did confirm to me that the scowl was something that he was pissed off about.
So I mean, there was this moment when there was this thing quite long, like for quite a while.
Yes, that was quite intense.
It was very intense.
Mm-hmm.
And it was also annoying.
And I can turn that off if you want.
I mean, whatever. I mean, but this is something like, I mean, as a person you would know, all right, it's good.
Don't you just keep it there?
Yeah. Or change it or do something with it. Or stuff like this, I mean.
So improvisers become more comfortable being critical in this situation where they're interacting with Maxine. However, he does still hedge. You must notice this when he says whatever. He doesn't really tell me that I have to do this. And then another example is with Francine, who is a 70-year-old American cellist, basically a funny old man who has lived and worked in Amsterdam. He's now based in Berlin. He's active in free improvisation, but his improvisations often involve dance and wordless improvised monologues in the middle of a musical piece, which is quite interesting to watch. And so, as I often do, I just asked him to do a quick sound check, not an actual piece. I just wanted to know whether there was a balance between him and Maxine at an acceptable level. And instead, he just closed his eyes and started playing with Maxine, and he was totally inaccessible for an hour. He sort of seemed to have fallen asleep. Of course, he denied that when I confronted him about it at the end of the piece. But he did keep on playing. So when I listen back to the tape, I can't quite figure out when he might have fallen asleep. At the end of this hour-long reverie, this is what he had to say.
I don't know. So what did you think? What was it like playing with it? You said you liked it.
Yeah, I thought it was. I mean, a lot of people I can see that they don't like it, but I'm not a person that reacts that much.
What do you mean?
As an improviser, I don't react to what someone else is doing.
You try to keep us a stream of your own.
I found it interesting in that way that it's a machine, and so it gives me a lot of distance.
You felt like you had some space from it. Huh. Interesting. And you didn't feel like that was a problem with it, that it wasn't too sensitive to what you do.
Right, and so here at the end, this is what's perplexing to me, is that I, as a designer, assume that if someone wants to play with a very sensitive improviser that is able to demonstrate some sort of attentiveness constantly, and he throws me a curveball and says, no, it's actually great that it's sort of a terrible listener. And so coming to the end of this, basically what we see is that there is an unassumability here, as Levinas would describe it, of the other's experience. Whereas Marcus wanted the system to demonstrate more of an attentiveness, Francis did not. And so it was difficult for me to really foresee what the scowl meant in the case of Marcus. And in the case of Francis, it was also quite perplexing to me that he didn't want the system to be a better listener. Coming to the end, I'll just skip it a little bit. I realized that proposing to have this methodology for others is something that a lot of us will find preposterous. So when I say that we should all learn how to program in order to do ethnography, and I'm not necessarily saying that, yes, you should, but another solution would be to develop collaborations and transcend this genius hero model, as I'll call it, that we have in ethnomusicology and many of the humanities and social sciences fields where we do research alone. So James Kippen and Bell's collaboration is one example of this. But then aside from collaboration, there's also the fact that there are numerous musical practices that feature virtual musicians that are being developed over time. So this is a Japanese virtual musician known as Hatsune Miku, you can see that there are thousands of people watching this performance. And so what I'm saying is that the kinds of phenomenologies that I'm able to elicit in this project with Maxine might be also possible to study by watching this rather disturbing, if I may have an opinion about it, Japanese virtual performer. There's also Shimon, which is a vibraphonist made out of robotic machinery and computers, which is adorable, as you can see the pianist smiling along. And then to the study of improvisation. On one level, we can see that free improvisers have developed a very unique form of passive-aggressive culture. However, the question that I pose to others who worked on improvisation is that, is this type of passive aggression inherent to any type of experimental music or creative sphere? Is this something that people always trip over, of being afraid to really be honest about what their personal preferences are in order to have some sort of tolerance and openness? So I will leave it at that, and thank you very much.